The combination of Visual Studio 2005 and SQL 2005 enables the development of managed code features within the SQL Server database. Because SQL Server 2005 now includes the framework, this allows us to use things like Visual Studio to go ahead and develop managed code applications that reside and run within the SQL Server environment. In this example, you can actually see that I've created a database. We're calling it DemoDB. And within DemoDB, I'm going to go ahead and write a managed code application that's going to run within the context of SQL Server. In Visual Studio, this is actually exposed through the concept of a database project. So as you can see here, I have a database project. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And the first thing that it does is it asks me to set a database reference. It's important to understand that since we're running within the database context, we need to go ahead and figure out where we're going to deploy our application. All applications that run within the SQL Server environment are actually deployed as assemblies. And as an assembly, they go ahead and run within the host of the .NET framework. And as you can see here, it's asking me, since I've made the connection, how do I want to provide debugging? And in order to enable debugging, we have to go ahead and stop all the managed threads that are running on this server. Once this is all done, you're going to notice that my project on the right-hand side actually doesn't have any presentation that's been added to it, anything like a Windows form or a web form. Well, that's actually because the hosting of the .NET framework and the fact that we're deploying assemblies within the SQL environment, those particular features aren't enabled. And quite honestly, you wouldn't want to write a Windows form application that ran within the environment of SQL Server. What you actually do want to write within SQL Server is things like managed code stored procedures, managed code user-defined functions. So a user-defined function, if you've ever written one, tends to do quite a bit of string handling or string manipulation. Well, using traditional T-SQL, this might be a bit challenging, as T-SQL doesn't have the advantage of things like the regular expression syntax available within the .NET framework. In this example, I'm actually going to go ahead and write a managed stored procedure. And as you can see, it goes ahead and exposes within the class stored procedures. And in here, it allows me to write a new stored procedure, and in this example called stored procedure 1. And you could certainly rename this to be anything that you want. When you're writing application code within Visual Studio, you do have access to the entire .NET Framework namespace, given some things that are considered traditionally presentation-oriented. So as you can see, if I go ahead and I add a reference, the Add References dialog actually allows me to go ahead and add what you would expect, things like system.data, system.security, system.transaction, system.xml, as well as connecting into things like system.web.services. So the reality is you're not going to be able to add in things like Windows forms and web forms. Within your managed code applications, you can go ahead and expose or return application context to the SQL Server environment. And this is actually done through the concept of a pipe. So in this example, I want to be able to go ahead and return just a simple message within the stored procedure that I'm writing here. And this is done by creating a new variable, sp, as SQL pipe, and exposing it as a SQL context dot pipe. And from here, I can just go ahead and say sp.send, and we're just going to return a string. This is a managed code procedure. Now obviously I could go ahead and I could write additional code in here that expose things like ADO.NET connections and all the rest. Once I'm done my application, I can right-click on this and I can select Deploy. What this will do is it's going to go ahead and talk to the database on the back end, and it's going to deploy the assembly, which I've just written here, into the SQL Server environment. And as we can see, the deploy has actually succeeded. If I go into Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio and we go ahead and we refresh our databases, you're going to see in the programmability section that we have a new assembly that's been added in. This new assembly is the SQL Server Project 1, which is actually the DLL, or the assembly that I just wrote. One of the things that you do want to remember is, as an assembly, SQL Server, when it goes ahead and deploys it, has added a bunch of additional statements into the T-SQL syntax. These new keywords like create assembly allows SQL Server to go ahead and bring in this managed code assembly, set a variety of permissions to it. So as an assembly, it is based on code access security, and when that's all done, it can actually talk to the database through the stored procedure environment. And really what this is doing is it's just going ahead and building a stored procedure that allows that stored procedure to execute within the environment based on the assembly permissions that have been assigned to it. One of the other things that we do have the ability to do through the concept of the My Project tab is that we can take a look at the different options that might be available. So as an assembly, we end up with things like assembly information. We also have the ability, as we saw, to set references, and then I'm setting some of the basic references here. We also can specify the connection string that we're going to deploy this into a different database, as well as provide code analysis. And if you're familiar with some of the features that are available within Visual Studio Team System roles, this is really an extension of that allows us to define things like security rules to be able to make sure that we're not writing code that might be exposing different security vulnerabilities. And then finally, be able to set a variety of configuration and deployment issues that we may actually have within our environment. I think it's important to remember that as we start building our applications and we start writing managed code within the SQL Server environment, that we're actually deploying assemblies. And within those assemblies, what we're really looking at doing is making sure that we have proper permissions set. So in order to do this, there's a couple of ways of providing it. So I'm going to create a new query, and I'm going to say exec, in this example, stored procedure 1. And we're going to go ahead and execute this. And you'll notice that I'm going to get an error that says the execution of code in the .NET Framework is disabled. Well, the reason this is disabled is that by default, we haven't turned this on for this configuration. So even though we were able to debug it, we're actually not able to roll it out and allow end users or application developers to go ahead and connect to this. In order to do this, we actually need to look at the spconfigure system stored procedure. And what you'll see here is that we have a CLR enabled functionality that's now available within this. By default, this is set to 0. In order to enable the configuration, we need to go ahead and set this to 1. Well, the way we can do that is we can say exec spconfigure. We need to specify the option that we want to modify, CLR enabled. And then we want to go ahead and specify the value that we want to set it to. And in this example, I want to go ahead and set it to 1. So we hit execute, and then once this is done, I need to run the reconfigure system stored procedure to go ahead and make this available within my applications, to make that option available. So I can then do an SP configure. We can execute this. We can run our SP configure, and you'll notice that my CLR enabled has actually changed from 0 to 1. So in this example, if I click execute, you can see that I get my managed code that executes, as well as get back the string that I've set that should be returned. Now this is certainly one of the big reasons that SQL Server 2005, one of the important features of SQL Server 2005, it's certainly not meant to replace T-SQL. It's actually an extension to it. So in some examples, you're going to want to, or in some situations, you will be able to go ahead and write managed code when it makes sense. T-SQL is certainly not going away. So for example, if I were to right-click on this, the default stored procedure is actually T-SQL, and that hasn't changed within databases. Managed code is designed to provide an enhancement on top of that, so that we really don't have to worry about doing a lot of coding within the T-SQL world when we could easily leverage some of the features that are available within the framework itself.